Welcome everyone to the third keynote lecture of DSA 2020. And this is going to be a lecture by Professor Shireen Hasim. It is being sponsored by the Journal of Development Studies, obviously one of the eminent journals in the field of development studies. And they are very proud to have this opportunity to sponsor a keynote lecture at this year's DSA. And they are particularly honored that it is Shireen who will be giving this lecture. So there's a two-way honor going on here, for Shireen to be asked by JDS and for JDS to have Shireen say yes. Let me introduce Professor Shireen Hasim, who I have known maybe for 20 or 25 years, I can't remember, before we go on to invite her to speak. Shireen Hasim is Canada 150 Research Chair at the moment in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. She actually did her PhD at York University in Canada. And since then, she has grown into a creative, influential, and a very balanced voice in the highly gendered politics of the field of gender and politics. Her interests lie in feminist theory and politics, collective action, and the histories of the mobilization of women and in social policies and gender. She has written and edited several books, including No Shortcuts to Power, Women in Policymaking in Africa, and Go Home and Die Here, Violence, Xenophobia, and the Politics of Difference in South Africa. Women's Organizations and Democracy Contesting Authority won the Victoria Shook Award for the best book in Women in Politics from the American Political Science Association. Her most recent book has been an archival recuperation of the work of the eminent South African sociologist Fatima Meer, and it's called Fatima Meer, A Free Mind. And she's also done some extremely interesting and thoughtful work on aspects of the life of Winnie Mandela. She is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. And today, Shireen's keynote is called We Are Not Poor, New Forms of Resistance to Extractivism in Zolobeni, South Africa. So over to you, Shireen. You have about 50 minutes. James will give you warning of 5 minutes and then 1 minute, and we will talk about the questions at the end. If anyone has a problem, just to let you know, any technical difficulties, please use the text chat function, or sometimes simply refreshing your browser will do the trick. So over to you, Shireen.
Thank you very much, Nada. I was just reflecting that it is almost 30 years since I had the honor to introduce you as the keynote speaker at the very first gender conference in South Africa, where you made the huge impact, and it felt like we were the really lucky ones having a taste of reversed realities, your now landmark book, just before it was published. So we were like really proud of that. So thank you very much for that. This is a very odd medium for me. So this thing of speaking onto a screen feels weird. So I hope I get the tone of this right. I want to talk about a relatively new struggle that's taking place right now, an unfinished struggle right on the eastern coastline of South Africa on land that is steeped in generations of struggle. This is a contestation that is raging between the promises of development that are offered by a mining company and its allies in government, and a thin necklace of communities fighting to defend what they call their conditions of life. The application for a mining license in this area began one of the most violent development battles in recent South African history, in some ways kind of more violent than the naked violence of Marikana. A convoluted struggle, I think, between categories of rights and interests, and one of those David and Goliath stories that one sees in politics. So I want to talk about the opposition to mineral mining, specifically of the pristine sand dunes of an area called Zolobeni. which has a number of enormous, I think, principles at stake. It is a struggle against environmental degradation, highly important in our time. But it's also a struggle that I want to argue is at the heart of the very complicated contestation of the land in South Africa, in which a kind of simplistic slogan like "give back the land" doesn't really have very much traction and will not resolve conflicts over the ways in which the power over land will be defined. So I think this struggle is at the heart of a number of unresolved redistributive claims, and I hope I can take you along to tell you this story and throw out some tentative ways of thinking about it. The Xolobeni struggle has already provoked comparisons with similar movements of indigenous people in other parts of the world, like the Wet'suwet'en in Canada, the Sioux defense of their lands against the extraction of the oil by the Dakota pipeline in the US. And I think it's part, obviously, of what's been called by Silvia Federici the politics of the commons, the new politics of the commons, a struggle to resist new forms of enclosure and to oppose what, as she puts it, the expansion of capitalist relations. I think it's also something slightly different and something more specifically South African, something that the South African struggles against apartheid and then in relation to the South African Constitution gave to the world as a particular way of articulating demands that are rooted in older struggles that use registers of opposition to exploitation that gave us the socioeconomic rights clause in the Constitution. And I want to frame it in that way because I think it gives us a lens into a hopeful politics, something we need right now, one that has retained utopian values, but is also usefully pragmatic. So let me begin, James, if you could put up the slide, the first slide and the second slide, one after the other. Let me begin by taking you to Xolobeni, which is a place, as you see, of gently rolling hills, of deep gorges with the very fierce Indian Ocean waves along the coast. This is the area known as South Africa's Wild Coast. You could go to the second slide, I think. Xolobeni lies between the Mzamba and Mtentu rivers. It is the traditional land of the Mpondo people. And in the particular part that I want to talk about, you have 5 village settlements, with Xolobeni being the largest. The Xolobeni village itself has around 320 residents. It's not big. And the wider area is no more than 3,000 people with, as is quite normal in South Africa's rural areas, women are the majority of the population here. All these villages along this part of the coastline fall under something called the Amadiba Traditional Authority. Before mining was proposed in the area, it was a relatively peaceable community, little crime or internal conflict, in part at least because this is an area where there are strong familial relations across the villages. This is communal land, nominally owned by government, in practice designated as customary land. I'll return to this in a minute. The occupants hold something very coveted in South Africa, a certificate called permission to occupy, and that guarantees secure tenure. It's the second richest botanical reserve in South Africa after the better known Table Mountain, with around 200 endemic species of plants. To understand the enormity of this, consider that the entire UK has only 40 endemic species. There are crops that are grown mainly for consumption in this area, things like yam, spinach, carrots, lemons, guavas, mostly for subsistence. Some of it makes its way to markets in Durban and East London. There's also a fair amount of cultivation of the illegal weed, dagga, as a cash crop. And as a side note, the growers are very worried that new legislation that both legalizes dagga, marijuana, and regulates its production will have a very negative impact on these small producers. This is not an area without problems, lest you think I'm romanticizing, and I'm definitely tugging at your heartstrings with these very beautiful pictures. The area falls under the provincial jurisdiction of the Eastern Cape, which has suffered under poor governance and corruption for the past 2 decades. It's the poorest province in the country. It's been estimated that over 70% of the population in the Eastern Cape live under the poverty line. The Xolobeni area has a youthful population. Over 2/3 of the people who live here are between the ages of 18 and 35. And that's because there are no jobs in the cities for them to leave home for. Literacy levels are low, which is also unsurprising, as the nearest school is a 15-kilometer walk away, and the community is reliant on erratic mobile clinics for healthcare. Virtually this entire population is dependent on natural water from springs, boreholes, and small dams, and very few of these households have access to electricity. The extraordinary biodiversity in this area resulted in it being brought under something called the Pondoland Marine Reserve Protected Area under an Environmental Act. But already by the time that this protected status was legally declared, an Australian mining company called Mineral Resources Commodities was eyeing the coastline's very rich deposits of ilmenite and other minerals containing titanium. And MRC's website says, very proudly that this is an area with so-called world-class mineral sands. In fact, it's among the world's 10 richest reserves of ilmenite. The MRC entered the country just after the end of apartheid, and it secured the rights to mine on the west coast, just up from Cape Town, where it established the Tormen mineral mine. Now it was seeking the rights to mine for the lucrative metal titanium in a strip that is 22 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. James, if you could show the next slide, I'd like you to just have a look at what happens to the landscape on the coastline when you do have mineral mining. This is what the Western Cape area of Lutsville now looks like. Depleted and degraded. Now, so it's estimated that there are, we can go back to a prettier picture if you don't mind, James. There are about 20 years worth of mineral in these sands in the Xolobeni area. And of course, titanium is a very sought after mineral. The company has allies within government, most notably within the Ministry of Mineral Resources. And so a process of designating the land as mineable began in 2002, just before it was made a protected area. It was granted a prospecting license and then a full license to mine in 2008. Even at this very early stage of the struggle, the process of awarding the license was considered to be suspicious by activists in the area on the question precisely of who had been consulted within the affected communities, and on the question of who did the environmental impact assessment and whether it was good enough. Around this time, Thabo Mbeki's government was laying out new rules for contracting in South Africa under the Black Economic Empowerment Program. So Mineral Resources Commodities set up a local empowerment partner called the Xolobeni Empowerment Company, which was now claiming to represent the communities affected. So predictably, as in many, many struggles in many parts of the world in rural areas, the backbone of opposition to mining is the women in the area, currently led by the very feisty Nonhle Mbutuma, who is one of the founders of something called the Amadiba Crisis Committee. Her colleague Siko Sipe, so-called Bazooka Hadebe, was assassinated in 2016, and Nonhle now heads up the Amadiba Committee. lives with a permanent bodyguard as she's been threatened so many times. Women are, as you know, in many parts of Africa, responsible for food production. So what happens to the land is especially important to them. In this area of Xolobeni, the women are drawing on very long repertoires of resistance to colonial conquest, and some more recent ones, like the 1960s struggle against incorporation into the Transkei homeland, which women were central to. They were also central to the struggles in the 1980s as the states of emergency took hold. And one of their songs right now in this struggle is Nomakubi Siyaya. No matter how hard it is, we will succeed. The women are fighting against government, but they are also fighting against people in the traditional authority structure. Traditional councils are divided on whether to allow the mining. The king has gone in with the mining company, but several officials at lower levels of the council are opposed to it. For example, one of the central struggles has been led by a headwoman, Cynthia Baleni, who has become a ceremonial mouthpiece for anti-mining resolutions in these 5 coastal villages. She took the lead in a case against the Department of Mineral Resources in the High Court. And in that case, Baleni lays out why it is that they are opposed to mining. She says that it is households, not traditional leaders, that have collective rights over residential and arable land, according to customary law, that many households earn an income from farming and fishing, and also from ecotourism, by the way, and that mining will displace residents from their home, ruin their fields and gardens, cause the loss of communal resources such as medicinal plants and wood, and block access to the sea. Should the mining license be granted, she says, she fears there will be increased pressure on schools and clinics and a rapid increase in shack dwellings. So that, on the one side, is the Amadiba Crisis Committee, which has a number of men and women mobilized, and which has managed to win support of a number of headmen and headwomen. On the other side are people with an interest in mining continuing. The chief, for example, and a mining company called the empowerment company called Golco, which has been established in terms of the empowerment regulations. And as part of this, of the empowerment regulations, and I won't go into the detail, but companies have to develop something called a social plan. They have to empower the community, right, in some kind of vague set of provisions. And that involves cutting some part of the community into the deal. And there's a debate, of course, of who that should be. In the plan for Xolobeni, there's only provision for community programs to run for 6 months. There's no guarantee for local employment. If the company sold on its mining rights to another company, there could be new BEE partners. And in any case, most of the jobs that are created by mining are going to be in the smelter part of the enterprise, which is envisaged to be located some distance from Xolobeni in East London. So what followed this mining license process is, you see, a community divided, powerful opposition, old narratives being introduced to oppose activists, like traditional leaders saying that opposition to mining is really environmentalism. Environmentalism is cast as a white narrative. And this is a very handy narrative in a highly racialized country like South Africa, right? So attributing the opposition to mining as being not an indigenous struggle by the women and men who will be affected, but as an outsider struggle. Against that narrative, I think the Amadiba Crisis Committee are very successfully arguing that we need to look to the future, to think of this land as being held in trust for this generation as well as for future generations, and that the mine will be projected to only last for 20 years, and we have to think what will happen after the mining company leaves the space. They've opposed, in addition to the mining, they've opposed an extension to the national highway that is now going to run in a loop to take in these pristine areas of the Wild Coast, which they see as part of a sneaky plan of government to facilitate mining by creating the access road. This road would also go right across Amadiba lands. It would bifurcate communities. It would mean some households have to be moved and some graves relocated. And here, in relation to the road being built, they've also taken on the government in the Pretoria High Court. So what I'm describing here is a 10-year war of political attrition using both direct collective action, like occupying the bridge area where a proposed bridge to facilitate the road was going to be built. Successful one. The 1.6 billion rand contract for building this bridge had to be terminated because the protests by the Jama community was so strong that they stopped any work from happening. So this is a long war of political attrition, and it's used many examples of direct collective action and mobilized communities in a really sustained way over time. But it's also, and here's what I think is specifically South African here, for those of you who remember struggles of the Treatment Action Committee, a campaign against the government's HIV/AIDS policies, right? It's also drawn on very experienced lawyers with a track record, both in the history of land, such as Tembeka Gukaitobi, and a history of fighting mining companies like Richard Spoor, who won a landmark judgment on the silicosis case against the mining industry. And they've had some success. Well, they've had so far a huge amount of success, I would say, in stopping this mining from going ahead. So I want to just draw a little bit on what I think is happening on the side of government, which has really struggled to have this mining deal go ahead, right? But has very firmly and clearly aligned itself on the side of MRC, the mining company. Ministers have changed in this 10-year period. The most recent appointment by Cyril Ramaphosa was the appointment of Gwede Mantashe as the Minister of Mineral Resources, early 2018. Mantashe is a local boy from the Eastern Cape, himself a former gold mine worker, leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, now coming in on the side of the mining company. You know, obviously, like many people, he's moved away from his radical worker rights past. But the more important thing he has done, I think, is to show very clearly both the extent to which the South African government has remained rooted in a kind of static and unhelpful way in the old extractivist model of economic development in South Africa, and the way in which the government is very willing to shift to using more authoritarian methods to ensure that it is not held accountable or that its development plans go ahead. So to give you an example of how this played out in one of the central court cases involved here in Kolobeni, the Amadiba Crisis Committee took the Minister of Mineral Resources to the High Court in a case testing the meaning of consultation. This is the case brought by the head women of the Mgungundlovu community that I spoke about earlier, Cynthia Baleni, in November 2018. Here, the Amadiba Crisis Committee was able to win a landmark judgment in which the court established a precedent that the community has the right to say no to mining without their consent. And it defines specifically that consent must be achieved collectively and must include customary law and governance practices, i.e. consensuality, and that this needs to be granted before mining begins. So it upheld what is called in legal language free, prior, and informed consent, which establishes a major leverage for rural communities all over the country in their resistance to development projects that are being imposed on them. Women in Mining, for example, which is an alliance of women opposed to resource extraction, has commented that the judgment is important because, and this is what I think is so interesting and South African, it was won through a political process that used local organizing combined with clear ideas about local development, political solidarity from outside the community, and the use of the legal system in a way that advanced rights. But looking back to the government side, every victory made by communities is countered in a kind of a cat and mouse game between the legislature and the judiciary. Right at the time that that Plenary won this really important judgment, Ramaphosa signed into law the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act. Now, this act gives traditional councils the right to sign partnerships with communities, even if they don't have the support of the communities they govern. So, this act resurrects some colonial and apartheid forms of traditional authority and reinscribes a dual legal system, gives undue power to chiefly authorities, and establishes them as the voice of rural dwellers. It allows them, for example, to charge rural land dwellers a tax or fees, which very much in line with how the colonial system established chiefly power in the 19th and 20th centuries. The bill goes along with another bill that takes away rural people's rights, the traditional courts bill, which women have been opposing for the past 10 years in South Africa. And the bill keeps coming back and has now been brought back by the supposedly enlightened Ramaphosa government. Again, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I want to just say, and you can ask me how later, that this is a return to colonialism and its vestige institutions, not a democratization of custom. In this case, it creates an incentive structure for chiefs to derive personal benefits from contracts to use the land, what Jean and John Komarov called ethnicity Inc. Just one example is the way in this area in Pondoland is the way in which King Ndamasi has signed a lease with a Chinese investment company in which he undertook to clear all the inhabitants from a 30-kilometer stretch of coastline in exchange for a low rent of R1 million a year, which, needless to say, goes to his account. And most recently, COVID-19 itself has allowed government an opportunity to suspend regular accountability mechanisms and push through an amendment to the Mineral Resources Development Act, a direct answer to the victory of the Madiba Crisis Committee, actually. So in April this year, as the sort of movement of rural women that's described in Custom Contested on that website described this government as being like a thief in the night, a diabolical conjuring of the dark arts of authoritarian governance, they say. But what this amendment to the Act does is push through during the emergency lockdown is that it simply takes away from the Mineral Resources Development Act the clause that requires that communities be consulted. right? So it lost that case in the High Court, and now it has gone through the back door to remove the consultation requirement completely as a condition, making the Amadiba Crisis Committee victory a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. So the long-term effect, if this stands, I don't think it'll stand. I think it won't stand a constitutional test. But basically, it is tying the Amadiba community up in another long, expensive legal battle against the state. And at the same time, the Mining Resources Company has opened another line of attack on the activists and academics associated with Xolobeni, and they've slapped a suit of defamation on activists and researchers for remarks made in seminars, university seminars and media, demanding 14.25 million rands in damages or an apology. This is the so-called SLAP suit. Again, Amadiba Crisis Committee and Xolobeni will make legal history. A SLAP suit has never been tried before in South African law, and it will be interesting to see how that goes. That case is just being heard. So let me just tease out what I think these tensions boil down to. First and most obviously, what we see here is that the question of land ownership goes beyond a simple one of race, right? One slice of the question that emerges here is who owns the land? Does the state own the land, or does the community own the land? Gwede Mantashe, in the minister, uses the old SACP, Communist Party and ANC language of nationalization. He says, nationalize the land belongs to the state devolves the right to communities, and it does this through the traditional authorities. So what he is intending here is not nationalization as in expanding the commons, public ownership of the land as against the market, but rather that who owns the land is that where the state, if we say the state owns the land, what he is intending that is that the state should have the right to marketize the commons and to decide on who it will sell licenses to. Okay, so one might say, okay, the land shouldn't be owned by the state, it should be owned by the community. But some of my brief encapsulation may show you that, in fact, the community itself is not a homogeneous entity, right? The Xolobeni struggle is about commoning, but the commons itself is not an egalitarian space. There are multiple claims and interests. There are different degrees of voice and power. Who is the community? Is the community represented by the traditional leaders? What about the interests that traditional leaders themselves may have, which may lead them, as in the case of Chief Ndamase and several other chiefs, shows that they may equally commodify the land in a variety of ways that go against the members of the community. So if you push me to say, well, what would you do? I'm tempted to say that on balance, the evidence is that women are most likely to be the reliable protectors of the land. And just to quote Nonhle Mbutuma, the leader of the Amadiba Crisis Committee, she says women look to the future. Not because of some nurturing capacity, but because they take the responsibility of feeding children. And she says, we can't eat minerals. Although many children across Pondoland are sleeping with hunger, she says, in our community, no children are hungry because we use the land. So what these women are articulating is, I think, a careful starting point for very careful and sustainable solutions. The second point I want to make briefly is that this community is facing up to the failed promises of development in a very direct way, and in a way that radically challenges what well-being means. This is the poorest province and one of the most unequal countries in the world. But after 2 decades of neglect, the people of Xolobeni know that in fact there are no jobs. that the formal or good jobs that come through mining will be short-term and will extract a huge cost. Government is arguing that mining will kickstart the economy like gold mining once did on the Highveld, and government and its allies keep saying in the media, well, you know, moving a few households is a small price to pay for development, and it will be offset by the benefits. But the Amadiba crisis community is very well aware of what the consequences are. And Butuma says, you know, we know if we move, we are going to end up in squatter camps and in shacks. They promise us heaven and earth and sun, but look at other areas where there is mining and you see how they live. If mining is so good, why are people living in shacks? Now, in making these kinds of arguments, the Amadiba Crisis Committee is not demanding an exit from the national state. It's not demanding a kind of closed-off indigenous order, but instead it's reminding us that there is no guarantee that the basic goods and services that are guaranteed in the Constitution will actually arrive, nor have jobs being developed in the way in which government has promised. So they don't demand formal labor, they don't demand paid jobs, nor in their language do they want to be called the poor. They don't see paid labor as empowering. And so here, to quote the Amadiba Crisis Committee, they say, we do have jobs, we do have livelihoods, we have agriculture which is sustainable. We are not unemployed, but we are self-employed. We are not the servants of somebody. And for them, being a servant means to be in the pay of someone who cares about profits. And they say, we care about rights. And we care about our rights as citizens to decide what is good for us. So where government wants to trade the land for services, what the Xolobeni community wants is a conversation on how basic services could be developed. They want a larger redistributive discussion about expansion of the commons and the ways in which we could have, for their purposes, a good, capable state with social protection and possibly something like a universal basic income as a way of meeting those needs. And I think those ideas are really timely at the moment in many parts of the world. Third, Xolobeni, I think, puts ordinary people into the theoretical conversation of what we mean by democratic decision-making. Now, I've tried to steer away from the word neoliberalism in my presentation because I think it often is just used as a slogan, but I just want to draw on something Wendy Brown in her very influential work on neoliberalism argues. She says what neoliberalism does is replace political logics with market logics. And she says what it does, its sort of pernicious effect politically, is the loss of what she calls collaborative and contestatory human decision-making, control over the conditions of existence, planning for the future, and that is the deliberate construction of existence through democratic discussion, law, and politics. And she says the loss of this has led to a global civilizational despair. Well, in that case, I want to say Xolobeni is an antidote to despair because it is a reclaiming of the terms of life and contestation by the people itself. So looking from this tiny little place in the Eastern Cape, I want to say all is not lost because I think what they have shown is how law and rights and contestation can be allies to radical redistributive demands, not hindrances. I'm working here against the pessimistic view that rights are simply empty, formalistic gestures, that in fact the South African Constitution is meaningless to ordinary people. And I want to say that's not true. This story and many others show that there is a long history of poor people, and women especially, claiming, articulating, expanding power from below, and that rights struggles were often the idiom in which this took place and are the space in which it is continuing to happen, and that when it is allied to the expansion of voice and power from below. Law can be an ally, and a good constitution can be an especially robust ally. I think this case of Tolobeni is going to have give us a potential way to test one of the key contradictions in the South African constitution, the unresolved contradiction between accommodating traditional leaders on the one hand and recognizing gender equality on the other. So it may help us going down the line to test that balance of rights. Finally, I just want to say, just in relation to whether Tolobeni is part of the same kind of struggle as Wet'suwet'en in Canada and so on. And is this an indigenous movement? Is it an identitarian movement? And I would argue it isn't really. I would say that it is a movement for commoning, but it is drawing on demands from histories of struggling for democracy, anti-colonial, anti-apartheid, but also anti the kind of hollowed out democracy of the last 20 years, and that it is asserting claims to citizenship. They are making demands that, in fact, are not so different from the utopian vision that already exists in the formal institutional framework that was crafted after 1994. They're not rejecting democracy on those terms altogether. It's very much a forward-looking strategy, I think. And that, for me, has the advantage that from the point of view of what can be pragmatically achieved, the struggle is important because it is a form of prefigurative politics. It tells us something about the potential capaciousness of democracy if we start to shift towards a serious engagement with radical demands from below. So let me end with that, on that hopeful note, by saying, by quoting Silvia Federici, who is also, I think, an ally in our struggle to find spaces of hope. She says the sense that we are living at the very edge of a volcano makes it even more crucial to realize that in the midst of so much destruction, another world is growing like cracks in the grass of the urban pavement, challenging the hegemony of capital and state and affirming our interdependence and capacity for cooperation. Federici points out that not all of these struggles are successful, but that they emerge is important and worth noting and worth marking. Because they contain the seeds of a new future. She says it is impossible, in fact, to defend communal rights without creating a new reality in the sense of new strategies, new alliances, and new forms of social and political organization. Tolobeni, I think, suggests that neoliberalism is not as all-encompassing as it is made out to be, and also that the political sphere really and the legal sphere really does matter. So, thank you. I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Nyla.
Okay, thanks very much, Reen. That was fabulous. I just want to pull out a couple of points from that and then throw it open. We already have a number of questions in queue. One of the things listening to you is I was really struck by how in so many parts of the world where the kind of commons that are critical for preserving the environment are having to be defended by indigenous people. It's happening in South Asia, you're talking about in South Africa, in Latin America, but their ability to defend is very uneven. So I think what you describe as the specific conditions of South Africa, we cannot replicate them. They came out of your history and we have to find different ways. And in Bangladesh right now, we have these very old mangrove swamps where they want to build coal mines. And I think the two photographs you showed us, the before and the after, tells us how hard it is to reverse the damage that is done when people engage in these extractive industries. I quite liked you trying to juxtapose utopianism with this useful pragmatism. But one of the things I was thinking is when you pointed out that women may be more, you can trust them more because of their concerns with children. But what we call utopianism is also about looking to the future. And it's about the word you just used once in your lecture, I think, about sustainability.
Mm.
It's about utopianism is really forward thinking about how to maintain and cherish and nourish into the future. And that's where the useful pragmatism comes in, because you need to have the steps that get us from here to there. I think one other point that I think is raised for me is, so in this particular case, they're extracting for titanium. But all of these industries are feeding into consumption patterns, and that we are the consumers. And so it really is beginning to make us think. I mean, this pandemic has been blamed to some extent about the industrialization of consumption patterns. But in all kinds of different ways, the kind of lifestyles and consumption patterns that we've become used to are really, if we have Federici's idea of a new world growing, it has to begin with us reflecting on what we need to be happy. What do we need to consume in order to be happy? And what I really liked about the group that you're talking about is that they value what I think what should be a model of values. What is important, what is worth preserving. And so I really found it a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. So thank you very much. I thought we'd take one question at a time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, with all this technology, it gets confusing. So we have got two questions. Actually, it's one question, but a bit long. Could I ask, let me put it up. So I'll read it out. It's from Ranjani Kanchi Raghavendra. And she says that legal recourse is the best option. Professor Shri, you mentioned that. Success. Could you tell us about the legal framework beyond the High Court against authoritarian methods to advance rights? Because legal recourse sometimes takes a very long time, for instance, example. So what do you think about the time frame to hear such cases?
Yeah, thanks, Naila. So let me just say something about the point you made about consumption. That's really interesting. I mean, the very specific question here is the thing I think we would all struggle to give up. And that is that even what we are doing here is made possible by titanium. It's absolutely crucial to our communication, right? It's this little components of the microchips and so on. But yes, in general, it is the kind of values being articulated here. This community is not arguing for fancy goods, and in order to if we were to have let's at least say a national conversation at this point, let alone transnational conversation about what would be the priorities of a country where you would want to allow communities like this, for reasons of collective good, to continue to be sustained, we would have to go into a question about macroeconomic priorities. And I think that's a very, very helpful direction that that this allows us to link the very micro with the large questions that are facing the country. And that's why it's such a pivotal struggle for me. Like, there's sometimes, every once in a while in the history of shaping our society, these struggles come up that ask the very fundamental questions. And this one strikes me is asking that. It is also, of course, asking what is poverty? What do you mean when you describe people as the poor? When a statistic like that I almost used, and then didn't, to say 79% of people in this area are unemployed, and they are saying we're not unemployed, we're self-employed. We are just not earning a large cash not a wage. We're not earning a wage. We are getting it in other ways, right? So, but what makes us rich is that we are not hungry, that we have this land, that we are able to live also at a pace that's slightly different, all kinds of good things. So that, I think, should not be something that is a question only for isolated rural communities, but a question that, as you say, should be posed to all of us about what is well-being. How do we want to define well-being in a way that's meaningful, more meaningful? So on the question of how, on the legal strategies, you know, what makes it specific to South Africa is that you did have a legalistic battle going on through the 20th century, and a kind of value that was placed on crafting a constitution and an idea of citizenship that was quite expansive. Mm-hmm. And the reason I want to kind of bring that in, even though I completely accept that it's not available so easily as a strategy, that as you know, the question suggests, that may take time to use this resource, that may take a certain kind of mobilization to use it. When you do have it, it enables so much. There's a very fashionable way of talking at the moment, which is to sort of say, these are Western constructs, rights are meaningless, you know, this is empty language, it's not the people's language. You know, this is just an example of how it can actually be much more capacious in its imagining than that. But what can be replicated from the South African story of the Treatment Action Campaign and Xolobeni is this alliance that gets forged between local communities with very specific kinds of grievances, let's put it that way, and activists working on a larger scale, including a transnational scale, and highly expert lawyers, right? That's the magical combination, which can be replicated anywhere, really. It's an approach to struggle, it's an approach to politics. It's not purely expert-driven. That never worked. That is empty. It is not a small, struggling, isolated community with no allies. It is alliance building, solidarity building across a large space. And it takes these questions and articulates them in a large way. So while I think we can, you know, using the law is not easy all over the world, and it can be expensive, I think there's a role to play here for activists and lawyers that are allied. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question. It's in two parts. You've said that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Has the nationalist government failed to remove such inequalities? Does neoliberalism sustain apartheid in new shape? Are the Amadiba community victims of neoliberalism as a new form of apartheid with a black face? It's a lot there.
Yeah. Well, you know, it is factually true that South Africa, on a number of measures, is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's also factually true that until 2011, poverty was being reduced in South Africa. This is really important to know. Up to 2011, the elaboration of a really good social protection scheme and the use of cash grants, particularly the cash grant for children, had a really positive effect on, let's say, the poorest of the poor. It lifted people out of poverty. There's no question of that. But between 2011 and 2015, that trend has started to be reversed. Poverty has started to grow again. And that, so, you know, I do think that that neoliberalism is part of the story, but actually what is more fundamental is a kind of is what happened inside government, which is the rise of a kind of rapacious elite who were and a perversion of the Black economic empowerment regulations, which are aimed at equalizing ownership. So removing some of the old apartheid era ownership patterns by forcing partnerships with Black people. But, you know, those tenders and licenses and so on became a rent-seeking space. And so, you know, deep corruption inside government has actually led to what's been estimated as a loss of about R1 trillion from the South African budget, and that has had very negative effects. Yes, you know, the fact that government has a Black face doesn't change these basically problematic relationships between state and society. Yeah, I mean, I think as a slogan, neoliberalism with the Black face, yeah, I think that is what it is. And certainly the ministers in the current government, you know, have and in all governments up to now have more and more engaged with some of the strategies of neoliberalism.
Our next question is from Sarah White. I'll read it out. Are there fault lines along generational lines within the community regarding visions of well-being?
Well, this struggle is this area. I said most of the people, 2/3 of the people who live in this area between the ages of 18 and 35. So it's a young population. Mortality in rural areas in South Africa, you know, the age of death is young relatively. So people between the ages of 18 and 35 predominate in this area. Their visions are very forward-looking and radical because they are young, I guess. Are there fault lines? I wouldn't say the fault line is a generational fault line because some of the headmen and the headwomen are older and they have allied themselves to the activists who tend to be younger. The activists, I think the younger activists have a very astute sense of more recent ways of protesting and so on. So their repertoires are very youthful, social media, you know, all those kinds of strategies. But I don't think generation is the fault line in this community.
Now, I did see there's a question in the text in the chat box by Emmanuel Lejim Eze. How do we decolonize land ownership in Africa to foster sustainable development in Africa? Land ownership and resource control is driving poverty in Africa. Today, herdsmen have made attempts to grab farmers' land in Nigeria. So now the big question, how do you decolonize land ownership to foster sustainable development?
What does it mean to decolonize land ownership, right? So, you know, in the South African political debates, decolonize the land is, you know, give the land back. That's the argument. But I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that this is really a complex process because you give the land back to who and how, right? So saying decolonize land ownership is the starting point of the debate. It's not the end point. It's not the solution. So in this area of Xolobeni, this is already land that is held communally, where there are no white, this is not area owned by white colonizers, let's put it that way. Although the context is a larger colonial dispossession and so on, in a very peculiar way, British colonialism in South Africa, which kind of worked through these collaborative chiefs, created it transformed the customary system in such a way that it kind of allowed and reified and kind of made static a certain kind of customary ownership of land. So when you say give back this land, I mean, what are we talking about? Is that's kind of what I wanted to pass a little bit in the story. Do you give it back to the community? Who represents the community? Is it the Kolobeni Empowerment Company? Is it the traditional leader? Is it, how are we going to structure that? Seems to me that is the starting point for a debate. I don't think has been resolved, and I don't think is easily resolved, because even traditional authorities are pushing for a form of land ownership in which they are the trust holders, not communities, right? And then it's not going to change the pattern here, which is that the land will be commodified. So decolonization doesn't necessarily mean decommodification. It's the same as saying neoliberalism or the blackface, really. Question has to go deeper, has to go much more than that.
Next question is from Whitney Barnier-Becker. Thank you. Is this work published? If not, will it be? Where can we keep an eye out for it? Had a quick search, but couldn't find it.
No, not published. I'm just starting on this work now. So really, I mean, what you're hearing are my preliminary thoughts about why it matters so much to look at this community, because I think it raises very big questions for all kinds of directions. But no, thank you very much, though, for the...
So we're very fortunate to have got a first look at what you're thinking about. Question from Sane Zuka. Given the high poverty levels in the area, does this have an effect on the dynamics of local communities' consent to mining based on free, prior, informed consent?
So that very important principle that the High Court, that the Amadiba headwoman, Cynthia Baleni, asked the court to rule on, right? She went in there and said, I want you to rule that a license can only be granted if it's on the basis of this principle of prior informed consent, right? That's a very democratic demand. In order to do that, you have to come and say, the mining company would have to come and say, this is what it involves, and you can't, do this vague promises of jobs. The fact that these are really hip young people who are watching what's happening in other parts of the country, and bringing that in. This is precisely why the mining company is suing the activists and the academics and saying, it's not fair what you're saying, that we're going to make the place worse. So does free, fair, and does that what does that really mean in this context? It means that decision making has to be people have to be fully informed of what any proposed development will do, and what they want to counter in relation to your question is the narrative, which is, oh, you're so poor, this will be better than what you have, right? So that's what the minister, Gwede Mantashe, is saying. This is a poor area. We are coming here with development. You need development. And in our eyes, development looks like this. It looks like this highway that's going to cut through your land. It looks like this titanium mine being established on this coastal strip. And, look, you'll have jobs, so you won't be poor anymore. Why, you're not thinking straight. And the community is saying, but we are not poor. They're wanting to, in a way, flip your question around. They want to flip your question around and say, what is poverty? We are not poor as if you measure it in terms of unemployment, if you measure it in terms of, obviously in terms of a whole lot of social indicators, yes, they are poor in terms of a number of social indicators, but they are saying very clearly, we are self-employed, we are not servants, we have a dignity, we make as much food as we want to eat, we can grow as much food as we want to eat, we can sell some marijuana on the side and that brings us in some cash. Actually, what we want are some basic services in our area, which you as government promised to deliver and have not delivered. And now you want us to trade our land for those basic services, but we're not we're not prepared to do that. When we want another kind of conversation, is what they're saying, right? But a lot of these development plans are sold to people on we're going to bring you the sun and the heaven and the earth because we're going to bring you jobs and so on. It's over and over again. None of that materializes. So they're very astute, I think, in saying we're not buying that, even though we live in formerly the poorest country in the world.
Next question is from Aisha Subani. Empowering women to access justice is more crucial for a more inclusive, fair, and violence-free socioeconomic political setup, particularly in developing countries. Do you plan to work on the gender-sensitive criminal system?
No, that's outside of my area of expertise. I think it is absolutely central. We do have a very large movement of women's organizations and advocacy type NGOs who work around in the criminal justice system in that field. There's a lot of work on gender-based violence, for example, and rape, around ways of, things like the importance of creating shelters, the ways in which direct funding under this criminal justice line from the budget, but it's not my specific area of work.
Okay, question from Deborah Lima. How do you think the common and natural resources as also a subject, such as the river in New Zealand and Brazil and mountains in Mexico, and how do we think in different law mediations for the uses of the commons?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big and really interesting and important questions that's been posed by the indigenous movements around the environment. So I agree with you that is what we need to think about. I'm still struggling with how one thinks about those sorts of rights. And there is a discussion about the environmental rights as an environmental justice as a category of rights that we need to bring in. And, we've had a period in which people were thinking about what was called the Anthropocene, so that we began to rethink relationships between humans and nature. We start to think about how we act upon nature in ways that are exploitative. And I'm thinking about the work goes across from liberal to radical. So Martha Nussbaum's done some interesting work on the idea of nature as a subject. And so there's a lot of literature around the Anthropocene, and now people are wanting to actually say maybe the way to think about it is the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene, that the Anthropocene wasn't specific enough. That's another big area of debate. So all of these struggles encourage us to think about those. I agree.
Emmanuel has been asking questions in the chat box, so I will take it. Should we be asking for any form of independence from our fellow citizens? Who are now our leaders based on your presentation?
Who are now our leaders?
Since it is all about leadership.
Yes. Well, clearly in this case study I'm giving you, the leaders are locally organized, mobilized people, right? This is so I think it does show you how the kind of you can't think of government in this context as a leader, as an actor. It's not going to be a leader in terms of getting us to a more radical future, to a more egalitarian future. But I'm all my work over my whole life as an academic has been very sensitive to this issue of the hidden spaces of leadership. The way, if you look at poor women, just women in general, who often seem to have no voice. No, I mean, Nyla, your work on empowerment shows this very clearly. In fact, women and other groups, not just women. I don't want to valorize or essentialize women in any way, but there are many ways in which once we stop thinking about leadership as a top-down, standing on a soapbox kind of thing, but as something that's more organic, that's more spread, that utilizes a variety of idioms, that uses in the case of feminist movements, for example, just rethinking music and songs as the space in which, demands are made and visions of, once you start to think of them as texts and as theoretical material, you see how much leadership happens in all of those spaces. So I have always been interested in the leadership that's happening at the bottom and the ways in which that articulates with the people at the top, who are important because they hold certain types of power, different types of power. And I've always been interested in that relationship. How can we make those people use the power that they have to make laws, to decide on how our public sphere will look like and how they will spend the money and the wealth that we produce? I've always been interested in how we can push them towards more egalitarian ends. So I think leadership from below matters.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Nafisa Esop Sheikh. Thank you, Shireen. Important research. Can you talk a little bit more on the problem of decolonization of land and decommodification, which may be said to be a Bantustan virtue? Is there no good private title?
Yeah, I mean, I've said quite a lot about decolonization not necessarily leading to decommodification, I think. On the question of private title, I don't think we've resolved this. Would individual title in this area be helpful for the people living there? I think it may provoke new kinds of conflicts. So one of the ways in which this economy of sustainable subsistence food production continues is because you don't have individuals who are selling off a piece of the land to build, say, a holiday house, right? That will have that kind of private titling in this pristine, beautiful environment, I think could have negative effects. There's quite a lot of feminist literature on whether individual title will make a difference or not. Thinking of the work of Annie Whitehead and so on, these questions have been come at in different places, and I'm not sure there's a resolved answer for rural land. I mean, obviously, in urban residential dwellings, there's a certain kind of security of tenure that comes from title. And so, I own an apartment. I feel more secure owning that apartment. I think everybody should have that right to title, but whether individual titling is an answer, I mean, I can't see it helping this community in any way.
Thank you. The next question is from Gareth Wall. Do the different levels of local government in the area provide any space for dissenting political voice and alternative visions of development, or are they all too captured by party structures?
Yeah, the short answer, I'm sorry, Gareth, the short answer is all too captured. And then if I had time to give you all the ins and outs and nefarious dealings around this, you would see how the councillor who spends now most of the elected councillor, because there's an elected structure and then there's a traditional council, and you see how these, begin to operate in cahoots with each other. But that's not because we shouldn't have elected councils, that's because there's a big flaw in the country, and that is the way in which the party has used access to the power to give licenses and tenders and so on in order to shore up certain local strongmen, right? So they become invested in it. And there's an absolutely brilliant book that I can recommend you all read about East London, which is the nearest municipality here, called How to Steal a City. It's by Crispin Olver. And he went like deep inside and showed how the corruption has infiltrated inside the local council to such a deep extent that you can't think at the moment as they work. At the moment, it's not an ally.
And here's a rather interesting question. If you say we want government to provide basic services, but we are self-employed and grow enough food and are self-sufficient, if people don't pay tax, how can the government provide basic services?
Sure, of course, but everybody pays tax. I mean, even these people are operating within a cash economy. We have value-added tax. Every single person who buys anything at all, really, beyond a very small base set of basic foodstuffs, is paying some form of tax. That's the one thing. People, they are paying taxes. The second is that we have a very we have a progressive taxation regime in South Africa. It's redistributive for the most part. We do have a very small number of income tax earners at the moment, but we also have very favorable tax regimes for corporates. That needs to be challenged. We don't have a wealth tax, for example. So I would want to say, let's shift this conversation. Let's talk in a slightly different way. You're right, we need a larger fiscus. Where will that come from? These people are, yes, they want some basic goods and services, but they're not the biggest users of the fiscus, actually, really. So I would want to make that conversation a bigger one. Let's talk about wealth tax. Let's talk about other mechanisms. Let's talk about, yesterday, actually, there was a really interesting paper in this conference on universal basic income in Ecuador, which was showing how such redistribution schemes can be financed if we rethought them.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Mwene Amon Ashaba. What do you see as the role of informal networks and ways of mobilizing for or against land rights? Whether these informal practices are by the state or grassroots women's groups?
Yeah, I think all struggles use formal, some mix of formal and informal networks, right? And there's, Amadiba Crisis Committee is somewhat formal in that its leadership gets elected. But here in this community where there's so many familial links across these 5 villages, right? There's, of course, informal networks and social networks and so on are all operating. Everybody's sharing knowledge. And so I'm not sure what you mean by informal networks in this case. I think there's a lot of social media, and there are social media allies for Tolobeni. There are academic allies like me who live far away from the community but feel tied in a political way, informally, to this. I don't belong to this community. I have I've self-identified myself as an ally for the kinds of things they are struggling for. And that's a kind of informal network, right? So you're all being drawn into that informal network because you have to listen about them.
I don't see any more questions. Does anyone have any more questions? Okay. Shireen, I thought before we conclude, and we're in good time, one of the things I thought that was very interesting about what you said was about the usefulness of the law. And this is something I've kind of thought quite a lot about. And I've been very struck by a distinction which I think comes mainly out of an African literature about the distinction between living law and dead law.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often portrayed as, living law is customary law. It's what people acknowledge, what governs their lives. And then you've got the dead law that's brought in from outside and is a bit of paper, is formal and empty. But I think what you're talking about, and what I think I've seen in many different parts of the world, is the way in which, and those people who dismiss the law don't need it to the same extent, who dismiss rights don't need it to the same extent. And I find that both the language of the law and the promise of equality and the language of rights is something that people have tried to turn into living law. They've tried to rescue it from the shelves of dusty shelves at constitutional offices and so on. And it is through testing that law and, seeing how the courts react to it. And I think, South Africa, because it has had such a progressive constitution, and there's enough in its law to allow progressive judges to find on the side of the oppressed, that there has been quite a successful kind of vitalizing of dead laws. I remember talking to a disabled person in India, a friend of a friend, and he was talking about how the language of disability rights just rescued him from being this, person who needed help all the time, a supplicant, to someone who could make demands on the state and on local government and so on. So I think, we should not dismiss any opportunities that can be mobilized to mean other than perhaps what they set out to mean. Yeah. And I think what you're talking about is a really, it's a very lovely illustration of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you. That's exactly what I would see as one of my projects across a lot of my work, is to not, because it can be so theoretically elegant, can't it? To just tell you a wonderful story about Kolobeni, the commons, this liberal state turned into neoliberal. I'm trying to do something more.
Okay, and the other thing I'm very glad is you didn't sloganize neoliberalism, because that has become such an alibi for proper analysis.
Yeah.
And I think one uses it when it's useful, but one demonstrates it and illustrates it rather than just using it as as the first thing you say. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Naila.
Great discussion, great presentation, and I hope I see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye to everyone else, and thank you.